Hello again, everyone. This discussion, lecture, movie, whatever you want to call it, we'll discuss what is considered the kind of canonical structure for scientific and scientific oriented papers. Um, if you have taken 119 with me or have been in any of my other writing classes, we discuss a different style of structure in the paper, but it's actually fairly similar. It's just that the scientific paper has a couple different sections and a couple different foci or focuses that it needs to address and to include. So this is the what's called the Imrad model essay structure. Okay. Now I will do specific discussions on each of these sections in future lectures, future videos that I put up. But this is to give you a broad sense, right, of how all your scientific papers should be structured. Now, if you're writing in the humanities, this structure will not apply to what you're doing because, as you'll see, the humanities deal with very different subjects, very different uses of facts and information and data. So in the essay structure, you're going to see things like what's called the front matter. Now this is the byline, the author or authors, and affiliation. Then there are keywords, word count if necessary, etc. And then an abstract. Now for English 300, you guys are going to be writing two different abstracts. You'll see how this works later, but the abstract is simply a 1 to 300 word kind of broad summary of what the article that you're writing is doing. Okay. So just to show you this real quick, I'll go back to this essay, which I very much need to finish. The byline, which is just your name, basically, and then your institutional affiliation, would go up in here. So here you have the title, and depending on, like, for example, like the class or even the journal that you're submitting to, they will have specific requirements for the style and layout that they want for their journal, for their publication, for their website, for their book, for the chapter, whatever. This layout is actually a bit different than what I'm used to because, and maybe I've mentioned this before, it's using a bibliography style, which is, I believe, called sequential numerical. It's a bit strange to me because it makes it hard, for example, to list page numbers. So here I have the author's name, just to give you an example. Here I have the author's name, William James, and then a simple 1. Now that 1 refers me down to the reference list, and William James's book is just listed as number 1. It's the first citation that I come across. Okay. APA and MLA do this very differently. This style of citation is actually more for scientific papers, but that's what this journal wants, so that's what this journal gets. So here, what I would do if I were putting out my byline, I would just put out Dr. Dustin Hellberg, University of the Bahamas, Department of English Studies, Nassau, the Bahamas, etc. So that would be the bio info. Some journals, they actually do want a short bio from you. So this is all just dependent upon where you're submitting stuff. For most classes and papers you're writing for class, you won't even need this stuff. The abstract, however, would go right about here. Okay, so it'd just be abstract. And then you would write 100 to 300 words about, what's the point of the paper. And then this is actually pretty important. The keywords. Now, keywords they're usually 4 to 5 of them. And the keywords are the specific things you're talking about in the paper. Okay. So sometimes the keywords are going to come directly from the title. So three of my keywords would be theory of mind, comma, um, second order intentionality. I just abbreviated it here. That's a very specific field of study. Evolution, evolution and art, right? You see that the keywords are just things that I am pulling from the text of my essay. Now, if I am dealing with, notice here I mentioned Aristotle. This paper is not about Aristotle, so it would be pointless to bring his name up. So there's theory of mind. Here's first and second order intentionality, or what I'm calling N order intentionality. Here, for example, I mentioned Paleolithic art. That is not a subject of this paper, so I wouldn't use that. Here I mentioned the author Samuel Beckett. This paper is not about Samuel Beckett, so it would be pointless to mention him. Free will, self-awareness, maybe. Other keywords can actually include authors. So I might actually want to mention Leonard Mlodinow and Robert Sapolsky because their books, I use them pretty heavily in this article. Okay. So those might be two keywords. And in that case, I would simply just put Sapolsky and Mlodinow just to kind of show you how that would work. Now, the introduction. So here we go. The IMR. Now, why they use A, I don't know, because it's actually results. But I mean, I guess it sounds better to say Imrad than Imred. Okay. All right. So, introduction. The introduction of the paper should basically try to aim to contain within, 1 to 3 paragraphs, depending on the length of the paper you're required to write. A good metric, just to point this out, okay, in case you don't know it, a good metric for paragraph length is that one paragraph, remember that Pilcrow means paragraph, one paragraph is about, not equal to, about half a page, okay? So you'll have about 2 paragraphs per page. So if you've got a 10-page paper to write, this will let you kind of know, okay, well, I can do the general content of the work, the research area. I can do that in a paragraph, okay? I can do, just kind of show you here, like maybe these two, and these two are all paragraphs, okay? So that means I've got now 3 paragraphs, okay, just from my introduction. The introduction, like I said, should outline the general content of the paper. In this paper, our research team discusses whatever, okay? Then you want to try to narrow the research area and state why this research is important, okay? Part of this comes from identifying the gap or niche in existing research, okay? So for example, like let's say, to go back to, what was the example that I used in the last one? It was something like, we're taking a medicine X, right? And we're going to give it to 50 people, and then we're going to give 50 other people a placebo, okay? So the general content, we gave medicine X to 50 people of ages 30 to 50, men and women, percentage was equal. And then we gave the same thing to the same demographic representation, okay? Now, something about this, the statement of importance and the identifying the gap and niche can actually come from the demographic that you are surveying. Like you could do this with an interview group as well. Like let's say that there are 60 studies, okay, of medicine X in similar demographics, but not, okay, in the demographics of the Bahamas. Okay. So we've surveyed people or whatever. We've given this medicine to, it's been done in Europe and America and let's say South Korea. The gap in existing research for your group here would be, well, nobody's done this test in the Bahamas. Okay. Now, here, that is a very clear gap in the existing research. So you would say, you would just mention that. That's the justification why you're doing this, why it's important. Okay. Specific research questions from this gap. We seek to understand if there is a similarity or dissimilarity between demographic groups given this medicine, let's say to lower blood pressure. Okay, so it's a blood pressure medication. And given all the stress that we're all under because of COVID, I think everybody's blood pressure is probably a little bit high, right? Am I right? Anyway, so these are the research questions that you're going to generate. Now, sometimes your research questions are very clear from the outset, depending on the kind of paper, kind of research you're doing. Sometimes the research questions are things that you are going to kind of figure out as you're writing the paper. Some, you might generate a couple new ones, and then all you do is you just go back in the writing and outlining of your paper, you go back and you just add those research questions later. This is similar in a way to how the abstract works. You never write the abstract before you write the paper. You can have a general sense of what you want the paper to be about, but the abstract is always going to be written after the paper's done because that's when you kind of know what the paper did. Okay. Now, the other things that the introduction has to do is a summary of approach to the answer, or basically you're summarizing what you did to answer the research questions. Okay. So you're basically just summarizing what you're doing in the methods. Okay. The methods get really specific. Our research team, over the course of 3 months, gave this medicine to 100 people, 50 of which got the medicine, 50 of which received a placebo. Okay. What we found was, so here are the principal findings. Now, you're not going into too much detail, not in the introduction. You'll see this when I show you kind of how the shape of the research paper works. You just want to say that we found that there was no significant difference between the Bahamian selected group and the other groups in Asia, Europe, and North America. Okay, cool. So you just kind of throw it out there and then just let it sit. Okay, that's when you move on to methods. This is actually super important in your papers if you're writing science or natural science or social sciences. This is where you list out. Now, this actually gets its own heading. Okay, each of these get their own heading. So in the paper itself, right, if you can imagine, here's the paper. Each of these, like introduction, gets a heading, and then you write blah 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 blah. Methods, okay, gets its own heading, and then you write blah 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 blah. Results gets its own heading, and then you write blah blah blah. Okay, so each of these kind of get their own heading. Now, you can see, for example, that in my paper here, my headings are actually, they're kind of, I try to make them a little interesting, a little bit more interesting. Sometimes, I make stupid jokes, which you would not normally do in a research paper or like a serious scientific paper. But being that I come from the humanities and I'm a writer, I can't help myself. So monkey see, monkey do becomes monkey see, monkey duality. Ha ha ha. It's a philosophy joke. Anyway, so in the methods, you just list out, the materials, the specifics, field sites, demographics, techniques, or whatever. What did you do specifically in answering your research questions during the course of the experiment or interviews or whatever that you were running? Okay. here, so this is actually, I mean, like field sites, if you're doing archaeology, or let's say you were doing a comparative study of this medication on people in Nassau versus Grand Bahamas, right? The blood pressure and stress levels in Grand Bahamas are going to be quite different than in Nassau because, Dorian plus COVID, right? So, field sites, so you would have to list that. Demographics, you would have to list out these very specific demographic controls that you put on there. If your demographics are, we just kind of gave it to anybody that willing to take it, well, that's not enough control in a scientific study, and it really wouldn't yield any valid results, okay? Observational or experimental procedures. This is more important if you need to list it, okay? Observational experimental procedures. I'll talk more about this later because I'm going to go through and do a talk, like I said, on methods, on results, on the introduction, etc. I'll just break them all down into detail, like what do these all mean. But yeah, sometimes observational experimental procedures are important, especially with lab work, like if you're doing like genetics or something, if you're using CRISPR, if you are introducing potentially new experimental procedures for analyzing, chemical interactions or whatever between drugs or the body or whatever. And then the methods of analysis that you undertook. This should be fairly self-explanatory, but like I said, I'll go back into some detail on these. Like I said, this is just the outline for the papers. Results, this is actually super important because if you do an experiment, typically we expect to have some results thereby. Now, here what you want to do is you want to list out the results of the methods, the experiments, whatever it was, okay? Of the 50 people taking the placebo, there was no noticeable difference in a blood pressure decrease compared to the people who received medicine X, okay? That's one of the results, okay? Now, here, the comparison, right, is where you're taking your results, right? Here's your stuff versus other people's. So you say, our results differed from other people's. Now, that will lead you to the interpretation, okay? This will lead you to your interpretation and the discussions. The results don't have to interpret. You're not trying to answer why here. You're just listing it out. In fact, very often the results sections in science papers are very brief. Like they could be something like a paragraph long because, most experiments are very, very specific, right? They're looking for 1 to 2 specific things. And so the results are going to be fairly limited in, you're not going to have, 40 different results from a simple experiment. So this is usually a pretty self-contained part of the paper. Now, discussion. Interpretation of results to answer research questions, okay? Now, this question of why, like maybe your results differed from others. Now, here in the discussion, you can actually address implications of why. Here, you're trying to do an interpretation of the results to answer the research questions, right? Our research questions were, are there any significant differences between demographic populations given medicine X and a placebo? There seem to be no significant differences, okay? You can interpret that as you see fit. There's some room here for your own subjective analysis. You also really need to address possible weaknesses and oversights in your overall methods, okay? One possible oversight in our methodology could be that we did not factor in for, let's say, long-term hypertension and stress studies, okay? Because, living in Grand Bahamas for so long, right? especially like after Dorian. Like let's say we're dealing with this 2 years later, the pressure and the stress up there is still going to be really really high, right? So it might be higher on average than people living in Nassau, where it's only moderately stressful all the time. So you see that that might be an oversight. For this leads to future research implications and future research prospects. But these oversights are crucial because when other people read your research and they read your papers, that opens up the door for them to do different research types. Okay, they might combine medicine X and Y in that same demographic in order to see if there is a result to that. Okay, you discuss your relationship to other research that is done. Super important to do because you are basically saying, here's our research, here's others. The relationship seems, at first, would seem to be strong. However, blah, 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 blah. Okay, it just depends on what kind of paper you're doing. Further research implications, once again, yields this. Okay, it yields other people's potential or your own future research implications. If you're working in a lab or you're doing graduate work or you're doing government work or whatever, you're working in a government lab, this is super important because this is how you get funding. This is how you get motivated. This is how you get other people interested in the research implications of the paper you're doing, okay? And then the prospect for future research, this is also super important because this all wants to lead to more money, okay? It's not wrong to say that all of us doing research in pretty much any field are all constantly fighting for money. Okay, there's a limited pool of money, especially for research out there, and we all want a little bit of it, right? It just helps make research and life that much easier. So being able to say the research implications create a much higher prospect, okay, or potential for future research will be a determining factor in whether grant institutions give you money, okay? So these are all very important aspects of scientific paper structure and methods. Now the back matter, what's called the back matter, sometimes you'll have these, sometimes you won't. It depends on if you're working in a group, if you got grant funding, okay, for this project, you absolutely have to acknowledge the people who gave you that money, okay? That's just, it's professional and polite. If you are working for a school, okay, and that school gave you funding, acknowledge it. If you're working at a lab, okay, acknowledge it. Personnel who helped you achieve this project, acknowledge them. I mean, it's professional and polite. You'll see in some books, authors will list. I mean, I've seen 3 pages of acknowledgments that some authors will list for a single book. They say this book would not be possible without, not just like my wife, my kids, my friends, but my colleagues, so and so and so and so, the wonderful administrative staff at UB, and so and so and so and so. You see, it's just the acknowledgments is kind of a nice little thing because people always like to be thanked for the work that we do. The reference list, this should be a no-brainer. You should always, 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 always have a reference list. All of the people you cited in your paper must be referenced in your paper. You should have covered this ad nauseum in 119 and 120. Do not forget these. Do not. Okay, I've seen it happen so many times where students just forget. I can see that they did the research. I see that they know what they're doing, but they just forget to put that in there, and you wonder why. There are certain times you'll have appendices. That could be a a breakdown. You know, you're talking statistical charts here, usually, or diagrams that the paper might reference. And here you would just list that appendix out. Okay, you would put it out there, and that would also require a reference. Data archives, probably you wouldn't really need to do this. This is actually pretty rare unless you're doing, goodness, I don't even know. Um, Maybe like genetics or chemistry or something like that. You wouldn't really need a data archive for anything that we're going to do, probably not even up through graduate school. Now, the general shape, just to point this out, here's the breadth of our discussion. Notice this. Here we have our Imrad structure. Oops. Okay. Sorry, this pen sometimes just starts writing on its own. So here's our IMRD. Now notice here in terms of the breadth of discussion, the intro is always going to be general. Think back. I don't know why it's doing this. Stop it. Okay. Is that a function of? That's strange. I don't know why it's doing this. And I don't know how to stop it. Okay, I'm not going to use this pen anymore. I don't know how to stop that. So, the intro is always going to be general because if you go back and look at the criteria that we outlined up there, you're generally addressing the things that you did, the things that you found, okay? Your research questions, they're all going to be very general. The methods and results are very, very specific. Okay, they are specific to the research you did, to your research aims, and the results as to what you found. You know, if your results say, we found some really interesting stuff regarding medicine X, well, that's not specific. What did you find? How are they interesting? Okay. Now, notice here in the discussion, okay, that's where the paper becomes more general once again. So you can see that the breadth of discussion starts off very general, swoops into specific, okay, and goes back out broadly to a general discussion of the things, the implications, the future research that might be possible from the research that you did in this little project of yours. So this is the canonical model for scientific research papers. Do not deviate from this, okay? If in a class you are required to do this kind of paper, do not stray from this, okay? This model is the standard practice. I have read thousands of articles in the exact same outline form that I've shown you here, and that is simply what we're supposed to do. So I hope this was helpful. And as I said, in the next couple of lectures, I'm going to go into detail on each of these sections. So I'm going to look at the intro, the methods, the results, and then the discussion parts so that you can see what all of these categories mean and how to apply them paragraph by paragraph as you are doing your research papers. So thanks.